from Ghostbusters, celebrating the national holiday yesterday. That is Groundhog's Day. Okay, near and dear to my heart. Anyways, so he's a weatherman, but he's not just any weatherman, is he? He's a really grumpy, jerky one. He's a big, sarcastic jerk, and treats everybody crappy. He's not friendly, has no love in his heart. He's a big jerk to his coworkers and everybody else. And he goes to what town?
He goes to the town, Pennsylvania.
town.
Punxsutawney.
Yes.
Yeah.
Punxsutawney, this little town in Western Pennsylvania. Yeah. See.
To see the revealing of the. He has to report on the revealing of the groundhog, whether or not he sees his shadow.
Of course. Yeah. And so what happens?
And so he does the newscast. He goes about his day, and
he's a jerk the whole time. Sorry,
yeah, he's a jerk to everyone.
We'll do this together.
Yeah. There's even like this really nice new female coworker that could be, is a love interest, but he's too much of a jerk to give her the time of day.
Yeah, and he's the big manipulative, just
self-centered guy.
Self-centered.
So then there's a blizzard, and they get stuck in the town.
I thought he said the blizzard was going to go to the volcano.
Exactly. So he has to stay in the hotel again, and they're like, well, we'll just leave tomorrow. So he wakes up, but it's still Groundhog Day, like the next day. It all starts over again.
Yeah, so basically he has God play this big trick on him, and he can't get out of the same day. No matter what he does, he wakes up, and it's the same day over again, and everything's identical. The music on the alarm clock, the same radio show, literally the same Groundhog Day, February 2nd, over and over and over again. As you might imagine, he goes mad. Imagine if you lived the same, whatever your horrible day is of this semester, maybe it's today, this is making it that day, but imagine if that never stopped. It was just over and over and over again.
And nobody remembers except him.
Yeah. So. Oh, that's the other good part. Yeah. Nobody remembers except him. So, what does he start doing? Because he's a big manipulative jerk. First, he starts using it to his advantage and taking advantage of people. So he's like, well, I learned all the tricks of the holes in the system and how to rob the local bank and how to do all these little tricks and stuff like that. And he's a big manipulative jerk. He takes advantage of the system, but then he gets really bored and depressed beyond that because he realizes that that's not a sufficient way to live life, and then he starts trying to help people. But in the manipulative jerk phase, he starts to take advantage of people because he can learn a little bit about them every single day. And so now he knows more about them than they know. Okay, so I want to introduce the movie because I want to show a couple clips because it actually emphasizes or exemplifies some of the things that we talked about.
He tries to pick up his female coworker by just remembering everything about her possible, but she never.
Yes.
She never accepts. Like,
so that's part of the manipulative jerk thing is he tries to pick her up and take advantage of her by learning everything about her and then pretending like he shares all the same interests. Oh, you love 18th century French poetry? Me too. Yeah, right? Yes, ma'am.
There's another movie that I actually do remember well that's essentially Groundhog Day. It's called 1201, and this guy he goes to bed one night and he gets electrocuted right at 1201, and he wakes up and he's stuck in the loop, and it's because somehow like every single day there's like some machine that these people have invented at their company that resets time.
Interesting.
But the problem is if they plan to set it off and it keeps going back the previous day on a loop, and he wakes up every night, and so he's trying to get it to stop, but he only has like 24 hours.
Yeah. Interesting. So the clip, I don't know that one, but it sounds interesting. But the clip I want to show today was from that movie, and I wanted to introduce it. So the little soliloquy we went down wasn't for naught. It was. There's a method to the madness. So I wanted to introduce it so people understood what it was that we were looking at. So there's one scene. So remember we said everything about the movie is just repetition over and over again. And there's one point that his coworker asks him, and she goes, "Do you ever get deja vu?" And he's like, "Did you just say that?" Yes, that's part of the side joke because deja vu means you remember. It's right. So that's a joke. But the thing I wanted to show is actually, let's see here. Okay, so we talked about who is Beth Loftus? Huh? Who is Beth Loftus? You guys told me that you were studying for the test.
Oh, she's
Elizabeth Loftus.
Yeah, mother of like psychology or whatever, right?
The what?
Like, I remember the name.
Yes, that's good. It's good to remember the name. But the question was.
Was she the psychologist that was proving that that memory is not always accurate?
Ah, yes. She pioneered. What's that, Francesca?
I thought you were talking about a character from the movie.
Oh, no. So context is important, right? So we can change the way we remember stuff based on the context of what it's talking about. So I kind of changed gears on there for a moment, but it will tie together in a second. And so she pioneered the study of false memories, how we can implant false memories. What were some of the ways that was done that we talked about?
Using the picture from their childhood.
Okay. What else?
The car crash.
The way you say a question.
Yeah, so you had the car crash example, the way we said question. By the way, I posted a chapter that describes this. It's wise to read that. And just interesting, I think, and cool and helpful. But that's part of the Reesberg text section that I posted. So familiarize yourself with that. It'll be a break from the biochemistry that we talk about today in the other sections. So it'll balance off a little bit. So she talked about false memories, how we instill them. Also by suggestibility, by making things more familiar, right? Like showing them a picture of their second grade class, you can make them more likely to believe that you were there and that they misbehaved, even though they didn't. But because you can engender this sense of familiarity, it kind of opens the door for memory to be modified and even created. You guys remember this stuff? Hopefully this is like just kicking off some rust and dust.
What was her name again?
Elizabeth Loftus.
Loftus?
Yes. And again, I would recommend checking out the slides we talked about, checking out the readings I posted on that and stuff like that too. And I think it's just interesting reading. It's a much more applied reading about everyday real life memory than the genetic proteins and channels and ions that we'll talk about for the other section of the class material. Okay. So with that introduction, this is something that I thought exemplified that well. So here, our big jerk, okay, Phil Connors, the weatherman, who's stuck in this little town in western Pennsylvania, Punxsutawney, for Groundhog's Day. And he's not yet reached the character development to where he's now trying to use each day to be a good person, help in every way he can. Here he's still being the devious, manipulative jerk. And so he really likes this lady, this little lady over here. And he'll come in and you'll see him do exactly what Loftus was telling us about and what that data tells us about, okay? And we don't think about it. Nobody looks at the movie and thinks about it because I'm a nerdy memory guy. I saw this yesterday. I was like, this is perfect for this class. Okay, let me know what you think. Let's see here. This should work.
Hey, you see the groundhog this morning?
Uh-huh. Never miss it.
What's your name?
Nancy Taylor. And you are?
What high school did you go to?
What?
High school.
Lincoln in Pittsburgh. Who are you?
Who was your 12th grade English teacher?
Are you kidding?
No. Your 12th grade, your English teacher was
Mrs. Walsh.
Mrs. Walsh, yeah. Nancy. Lincoln. Walsh. Okay, thanks very much.
Pretty weird, right?
Hey!
It's the next day. I told you everything recycles, right? Groundhog's Day once again. But he was being manipulative. He learned his little things he learned. Now he's going to try to do the Loftus approach to
Nancy Taylor! Lincoln High School! I sat next to Mrs. Walsh's English class.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Phil Connors!
Wow, that's amazing.
You don't remember me, do you?
No, of course she doesn't. Didn't happen. Even has to do with the problem. False.
I was short and I was crowded.
Gosh, how are you?
Great. You look terrific. You look very, very terrific. Listen, I gotta go do this report.
Blushing.
Are you a reporter?
I'm a weatherman with Channel 9 Pittsburgh.
Oh, gosh, I should have known. That's great.
But maybe later we could
Yeah, whatever.
stay right here. Promise me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Okay.
Wish me luck.
Bye.
All right. So, did that exemplify some of the stuff that we were talking about? Remind us of some of those details. I mean, was it not really very close to precisely of some of the experimental paradigms that we talked about? Now, of course, the experimental ones were fairly benign. This is a little bit more malicious and not quite benign because he's toying with her emotions. And later on, they're making out in the movie, and he actually says the other girl's name who he likes, and she's like, huh? And he's like, yeah, don't worry about it, whatever. And so you can see that he's really not serious about that. He's obviously just taking advantage of it, which is not good, but it shows how he used that Loftus approach. Or I shouldn't call it the Loftus approach, but it's a way that she helped to pioneer in our understanding of how some of these false memories can happen. So, a fun way to do that, with good timing for yesterday's holiday.
You should consider watching Inception when you get time.
I should consider watching Inception or Exception?
Inception.
Inception. I will most certainly add that to the list.
Yeah.
Is it like that?
It's the one that we talked about last.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I will add, was it 201?
It's 1201.
12 some.
Like the time, like 12:01.
Oh, I see. Okay, cool. Well, we will add it to the list. So did anybody take my suggestion from the very first day, so long ago, about checking out that fun book on memory in the movies that I recommended? Yeah. So we can make our own list as we move along and add that. And I'll bring the book in, or I'll send a link if you guys are ever interested. I'm happy to lend it to somebody or whatever. You guys can, I don't know, share it or something. And we'll add our own memory movies to the list. Yes, ma'am.
Have you seen Edge of Tomorrow?
Edge of Tomorrow.
It's kind of like.
Isn't that today?
Yes. It's kind of like that, except it's more like war and stuff. A guy lives the same day of war over.
Oh, that's horrible.
Yeah.
I have not seen it, but we will add that to the list. Okay. So I need to lecture for today, but I'm gonna hope that maybe one of you guys can start that list and email it to me, and we'll share it, or we'll do something with it. So we got those 3: 1201, Edge of Tomorrow, i.e. today, and Inception, not Exception. Notice that I'm trying to remember these things by adding more elaborate little phrases to them for myself to remember. That's a way that we can do this deeper encoding, elaborative encoding, that helps us remember stuff, like some of the tricky stuff that we might need to get tested on. So sometimes you guys have been asking through the semester about little tips and tricks to, well, how do we remember a little bit more about this or prevent this type of forgetting? I'm trying to show a couple examples of how I try to strategize that. Do that too. All right, so fun stuff aside, also elaborative encoding, making it fun, making us laugh, tying it together by weaving those rich connections that build our broader networks of memory, which we also talked about. Okay, so trying to do that stuff. Let's take a look at what we will be talking about today. Okay. Okay, so we talked about long-term potentiation last class a lot, and so we're going to talk about a couple of follow-up aspects to it. So we talked about establishing long-term potentiation last class. Do you remember? And it looked, we kind of had a graph that, you had our baseline pattern of EPSPs, field EPSPs. Remember? So when I was doing my qualification exams for our PhDs, we had one of the questions that I had to do was to draw LTP in front of 6 people that were sitting like you guys, except a little angry because they had to be grading us all day. So, but they were actually weren't angry; they were really nice. But they're doing the job of an academic firing squad, right? And so they said, they gave me a marker and they said draw. So be sure that you can draw and label each part of what LTP is. You may or may not have to do for the test, but what you will learn from it might be tested on the test too. It's a way to, rather than just the rote rereading of stuff, use your arms and legs, draw. Drawing is a great way to do it, especially if you guys have taken neuroanatomy or neural systems. Get some tracing paper, put it right over your textbook pictures, and just draw with a cheap set of pencils, color pencils. It's a great way. They make, actually they make neuroanatomy coloring books that I know neurosurgeons who still use just to keep up and practice. And it's kind of fun and relaxing too. So we have LTP. Remember, we have potentiated field EPSPs that go all the way to the long-term not just the short term. That would then stop. Okay? So be able to draw that stuff. And when we have that, we talked about some aspects of how that's served, right? So we have our membrane here, and there's channels in it. And we have AMPA and NMDA receptors, right? NMDA receptors have that magnesium blocking positive ion. Okay, so we're going to talk today about some basic ideas. One is that there's these different stages in which our memory trace evolves, which goes back to William James' ideas that there's different stages of memory. And we'll look at we're going to break this LTP mechanism down as an example of a neurobiological basis for neuroplasticity that can serve as a foundation for what might be underlying our changes based on experience. And we'll talk about how there can be different stages of this memory trace that can be differentially vulnerable to being disrupted over time. So again, what we're going to talk about is a lot of timing. Remember we talked about looking at different graphs of data last class and how we talked about being able to interpret them based upon the different timing insights that they gave us. Remember we practiced interpreting some of that data? Say, what does this tell us? How do we interpret it about the different timing of these things? So we'll talk about that, and namely how that matches on to this idea that memory is in stages, because there are different stages of neurobiological creation of these synaptic forms of plasticity. Okay? And so during some times, by time, right, we're talking about the x-axis of this LTP graph, right? So there's different points in this time in which, say, if you stimulate during, or if you do something to disrupt this early phase in time versus this late phase in time, right? So here to here or here to here, can differentially either strengthen or disrupt that memory. So we're going to look at that a little bit. That's sort of an overview of what we'll talk about. We'll talk about a lot about the molecular and receptors that are involved in this, namely those glutamatergic receptors, which are which three for glutamate, and which one of those, or two of those, are we going to focus on for LTP?
Kinase and MDA?
A little louder.
AMPA, NMDA, and kinase.
AMPA, NMDA, and kinase. Which is the odd man out for our LTP conversation? Kinase. Yeah, I almost put the other thing. You gotta be careful which fingers you use to count alphabet for the class. But yeah, so we're going to talk about AMPA and NMDA. We already looked a little bit at our NMDA receptors here, right? But what we're going to talk a lot about today are these AMPAs. Why are we going to talk a lot about them? Based on either what we talked about last week or what I'm presuming and expecting that everyone had come prepared with.
They maintain potentiation.
They are involved in maintaining potentiation.
You can't affect them after they've already, like, you can't block long-term potentiation after it's already started.
Well, you can disrupt LTP by messing with AMPA receptors. Yeah. Do you guys remember the critical point that we talked about? Each of these receptors play different critical roles. This one, by virtue of its magnesium blocker and the temporal profile of its influence on LTP, but this receptor played a critical role by virtue of its ability to be inserted or removed from the membrane. All right, so we're going to talk a lot about that and the different timing in which it can be stabilized or disrupted. Okay, and namely, we'll talk about this early generation of LTP and then how it can be stabilized. Okay, so remember, this is our basic forms of LTP. We can see that it can be differentially affected by different theta burst stimulation, 4, 8, and 1. We can see that changes the relative magnitude of LTP here. Okay, so we can see that this can happen, and LTP can happen really fast, even as short as 1 minute after our inducing stimulus. So that's what our arrow is. Remember when we look at this graph? So when I said people ask me to draw this, and you should be able to draw it too. You always want to draw the stuff that's really important for the reader to understand. This arrow is really important to understand everything that's happening here, isn't it? What if you didn't have an arrow? And you're explaining this to a neophyte, right? It's very difficult to make sense and to really have somebody look at this without you teaching it and know what the heck's happening, but at least you know something special is happening here. And then we can see that something special seems to happen afterwards, probably as a consequence of whatever it is that this arrow is reflecting. Okay? So this should also provide some sort of example for you guys to think about when you're presenting your articles, your presentations. As you show some data, walk us through each aspect of the graph. Try to mirror some of the ways that I'm doing it as well in that regard. So introduce the y-axis, the x-axis, and what each parameter is in the legend so that people understand what's happening. Okay? I guess I don't do that all the time, but I do try to do that in hopes of being helpful. So we've already talked about our field EPSPs. We have our baseline patterns of them. We have this high frequency stimulation here, at least that's our inducing stimulus, and we can see that almost immediately, right, if we have time here, almost immediately, within 1 minute, we can see these change in the responsivity of that synapse. Okay, and of course we know that that extends long term and it can be affected by differential patterns of the state of burst stimulation showing over here. Okay, but the thing is that these changes that we see almost immediately and the ones that are evident long term are differentially sensitive to being both stabilized or cemented and disrupted or broken up. Which should make a lot of sense if we take a step back in our thinking, just like big picture it, right? Sometimes there's a lot of stuff that happens in life that interferes with our ability to really solidify our memory, and we basically end up forgetting that stuff, whatever that is. Versus there's other times, other things, that memory gets really stabilized, or whatever we're learning, the blessing. Okay, so we'll look at that in a neurobiological context, and some of the factors that we can identify to be involved in affecting that. Everybody on board? All right, cool. So, let's take a look. Remember, we have our basic plot of LTP here, our control, right? Nice LTP plot in red, okay? But remember, we talked about disrupting this. And if you apply this low frequency stimulation, something that we found was if you apply the low frequency stimulation earlier in time, we actually talked about it leading to LT what? Okay. D, depression. Which it doesn't look like this then, now they come down here. Okay? Now, you had our high frequency stimulation, but what this gray bar is doing is basically representing when you follow that with low frequency stimulation. What we can see here, okay, is when you do that, okay, it disrupts our LTP that should go out here. Instead it goes wah, wah, and it starts to become attenuated. You guys know what attenuated means? Anybody like speakers and sound systems? You press the little attenuate button and the volume goes down. Right? So it just means lessened. So we have lessened LTP or an attenuated LTP here by virtue of this low frequency stimulation that happens here. What if you do it later in time? There. No dice. Doesn't matter. You can do it all freaking day. Doesn't affect it. So what again? It tells us there's a temporal profile here. Something's happening in time that's operating differentially at the synapse. Okay? So we talked about it, how it can prevent that stabilization even within a minute. Okay? But if it does not prevent, okay, this durable LTP. So by durable we mean long lasting over time if you do it later in time. So something's happening here really early that must be important, right? So we're kind of approaching this like detectives or sleuths. It's kind of like a mystery story, right? And we need to try to figure out what's happening. Right now we've just got a big clue, right? Something happened at this time that seems to be really important. Make sense? Okay. So, and then something happens later that is not important at all. Also really helpful to know if we're piecing together the puzzles of this mystery. Right? Cool. All right. So we'll talk about these synaptic changes that are going to be evident and being susceptible to this vulnerability to disruption. Okay. Now we talked about these AMPA receptors a few moments ago. These are these guys we drew here. You guys have the misfortune of suffering through my atrocious artwork. But I have special treats for you today to salvage you from that horrible sentence you must serve. Okay, I got some nice pictures for you today. So we have our basic model of our dendritic spine and our AMPA receptors that are in the membrane. And remember we talked about this idea that they're constitutively recycling, which means they're always being inserted into the membrane and then endocytosed back out of the membrane. And then we also talked about how they can be inserted into the membrane or not based upon synaptic activity. Okay, so two different ways AMPA receptors can be inserted and removed from the membrane. One is constitutively, which just means normal recycling. The other is based on activity. Okay? So we talked about that, and the idea is that they're residing in kind of this postsynaptic density, and what we want to do is be able to use this postsynaptic density to be able to cement them in so that they're not so easily taken out and disrupted. Because we want to preserve our memories. At least we want to preserve our good memories. Sometimes the bad memories are helpful to remember too, right? So that lady on television, on the Bill Murray clip that we watched, it's unfortunate that she forgets the next day what happened because he can take advantage of her again the next day, right? So you kind of, even though she might have maybe a sad memory or a bad one, you kind of want to remember some of that stuff so we don't make the same mistake twice, right? So we want to stabilize these memories, even the bad ones sometimes. Question? You good?
No.
Oh, I thought you had. Okay. So we're going to talk about some ways that we can strengthen this, and sometimes sometimes you want to break this down so that you can insert more of them in and then re-strengthen. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and there's two main things we're going to talk about as factors that allow this stabilization to happen. Okay, delivery of more AMPA receptors into the PSD seems to be dependent upon one, these dynamics of how the trafficking occurs of these receptors. By trafficking, we mean taking these and moving them here, or taking them here and moving them out. So it's trafficking, movement of these receptors. And two, based upon how something called actin is regulated. Okay, so actin is a structural component of the neuron, and it provides what we call part of the cytoskeleton, or the skeleton of the cell. So it's kind of like our bones give us structure. Actin is kind of like the neuron's bones. And just like our bones, they can be broken and re-healed. And it's probably not the best example, but it can happen, and we'll talk about it, how each of these factors leads to having increased AMPA receptors in our membranes that serve as the basis for our cellular model of learning and memory. Okay? So we talked about this idea that we have this constitutive recycling of AMPA receptors, but there's a couple more players that we'll talk about here, okay? So this is our introducing our basic model that we'll talk a lot about today. Okay, so here's our dendritic spine. We have different zones, basically, of our sort of perisynaptic zone, sort of outside of the synapse coming in, and then we have our synaptic zone, we have our postsynaptic density here of all that stuff. Remember, we had our extracellular matrix on the outside, we have our NMDA receptors in green, and our AMPA receptors shown in pink. But they're not just an AMPA receptor here, they've got a couple friends hanging out with them, okay? We'll talk about what some of these molecular features are, okay? And a couple of them, as we see in here, it's going to be this little blue component we'll call stargazing, okay? And a couple other serines as well. Crazy numbers and all that. Now, let's break this down a little bit and talk about how each of these components are going to be related to this different cycling of our receptors through the membrane. Here it's really easy to just follow our arrows because we want to take it across this way. Okay? So, these that are our extrasynaptic receptors, such as these, that are extrasynaptic, but what we mean by that is beyond the synapse. So the synapse is up here, right? So these are going to be more easily movable or more mobile than those that are in our postsynaptic density. For the obvious reasons that you can probably imagine that we've talked about, this postsynaptic density slows movement down. It's kind of a cementing structure. Okay? It holds stuff in place, and for good reason. So these are going to move a little less than these on the outside. These can move a little bit more freely. Okay? This should be pretty intuitive when we think about it in this context. Okay? And this normal recycling of these receptors through our postsynaptic density, the idea is that they can be captured once they come through here, endocytosed and repackaged to come back and process through. Okay, now there's a couple of things here to note. We have these AMPA receptors, and they're mobilized then to move through here. Okay, and they're going to move laterally across this domain, just like we said before. So they're going to be kind of think about it. I think about it kind of like this is kind of like a sidewalk. You need to walk across it, like that old Beatles album, or Beatles walking across the crosswalk in the street. You guys know what I'm talking about? It's kind of this iconic pop cultural image. Okay, so we have that, and as we talked about, some of these receptors get trapped here, and they become immobilized, and that can help us in forming some of these things. Okay, but some of them also leave this membrane again endocytosed for that recycling purpose. Okay, now we talked about these extra players. Okay, so our AMPA receptors have different sites that can be phosphorylated. Remember, we introduced these terms of vocabularies last class. Okay, so that's what these serines are, and we'll talk about them as we get in more depth throughout the discussion today. Okay, and the big idea here to take home is that when we have an LTP stimulus, this big jolt of electricity, so electrocute these cells, right? What's happening is that the role of that activity, what it's doing neurobiologically and synaptically, is to reorganize this constitutive process. Okay? And the purpose of reorganizing that constitutive process is to take advantage of this idea that these receptors are constantly moving through the membrane and use it as an opportunity to stick more AMPA receptors into the membrane by virtue of the PSD. Make sense? All right, we're going to talk a lot about that. Okay? Now, I told you I had treats for you. By treats, I mean salvage from my horrible sentencing you to my terrible joint. Okay? So we talked a lot about AMPA receptors. This is how I draw an AMPA receptor. This is what an AMPA receptor actually looks like. Okay? So we can think about it either way. They're totally interchangeable. So what I'm going to do is take a little quick tour around an AMPA receptor for you, so that when we talk a lot about these receptors, we can look at them like we do here, just these little cartoon blurbs. Remember I talked about how they were these little transmembrane proteins and all that? I did that last class. We're going to take a look at it in that capacity as well, so we know what it is that it looks like. As we talk about these things, it'll help us to place it into context, I hope, and hopefully help us to dial it in and cement it ourselves for our own memories to be made about it. So let's take a little tour there, and we'll look at the complexity of it, which should make us then better suited for remembering the basic versions that don't need all the complexity. Because we're going to talk a lot about crazy, like weird stuff like SARE, 818, 845, 831, all these serines, and it's going to be like, okay, this is actually simple now. Because we see how much more complex it really is. So here's our friend, the AMPA receptor. Okay? Here's our intracellular, here's our membrane. We have outside the cell, inside the cell. What we can see is this 4 transmembrane protein. Okay? Transmembrane, TM. And we count those times that our protein crosses the membrane, or goes transmembrane. The first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time. And that's so crazy, it's so weird. I don't even know why they do this. Then the first time it crosses the membrane, this transmembrane region is called the 1. And then when the protein goes across the membrane a second time, they call this transmembrane section 2. So weird, I know. I don't know where they get this. I don't know where they come up with this stuff. And then I can't figure this out. Maybe you guys can help me. But then the third time it crosses the membrane, this protein, for some reason they call it transmembrane section 3. And then they just got wacky and got kind of carried away. I don't know. They just called this 4th time that it crossed the transmembrane, or across the membrane, the transmembrane region 4. Okay? So we see all these weird abbreviations, but hopefully we can see that there's a method to the madness. And it helps us to just dial it in and say, oh, okay, this all makes sense. It's pretty simple. Okay? Now we can see that there's also not just these sections that cross the membrane, right? But there's a bunch of stuff outside and inside the cell. Right? We have this intracellular domain and an extracellular domain. This isn't a full biochemistry class. We're not going to talk about the N domain and the C domain and all that kind of good stuff. But the idea is that there's a lot of protein that extends out beyond the cell. This is going to be where some of our binding sites are for neurotransmitters to open these cells, or excuse me, open the receptors and the pores, because ultimately this is a channel, right? It's like a tunnel for cars to drive through or something like that. We don't have a lot of those in Dallas. In other cities you do. But there is one in Addison. There's a tunnel in Addison. I guess there's one down by Will Rogers downtown too, huh? Yeah, so we have tunnels. And stuff to go through that tunnel or channel. And let's talk a little bit more, because this doesn't actually look like this. This is a gross oversimplification. You're probably like, well, okay, how can it get worse? Well, it does. So let's take a look at how these proteins actually look. Okay, so they don't look like our straight French fries here. They're actually curly fries, like these kind of guys. So this is looking down on top, going the whoop this way. And this is what I drew last class. That looked like that. Remember? That's what this is. 1, 2, 3, 4. Teal, green, yellow, pink. Teal, green, yellow, pink. Right? I'm not as bad of an artist as I make out. Well, I kind of am actually. But you guys can see that there is a correspondence to what was being depicted before. So here's looking down. This is what it looks like in the same context of what we looked at here. Extracellular, intracellular, and our transmembrane protein sections. Extracellular, intracellular. Notice there's only a little bit in here, but there is it. It is intracellular. A lot hanging out outside the cell, just like we see here. All right. So see how we've broken it down from a simple cartoon. This is the same. These are our same subunits. Okay. Our subunits are going to be each of these little sections. That's what these different colors represent, are different subunits. Have I lost people? I should ask too. Slam on the brakes when the car's going too fast. It's okay, you don't have to tap them. Just throw your hand up there and be like, whoa, 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 slow down. That's cool. It's not going to crush through this. So we have these different subunits in different colors, and it shows they kind of look like this, these curly fries. Okay? Now there's different spots on here that our neurotransmitters can bind to, like that spot. Okay? Or this spot. Okay? So it kind of shows you where we have our spots for the ligand spots. Cool? Okay. We can look at it in even more detail. Okay? Here we have one of the first ever images, structural images of these proteins. So remember, we talk about them as channels, but we can also talk about them as proteins. Both are true, because the channels are proteins. And so for a while, we didn't know what it looked like exactly. And as technology and science and research advanced, we became able to take these microscopic looks. And this is one of the first images that was produced of it. Here we have our extracellular, here we have our intracellular, and this is our phospholipid bilayer. And of course, these are our transmembrane sections that cross that phospholipid bilayer. And we can see that there's these intracellular sections. And what we can do is again, this mimics what we saw here, right? Just like we have these little residues here, these little binding sites, we can see those binding sites exhibited here as well. And if we take cross sections looking down the tube, like that, we can see that at different points, in different slices, it looks different ways. So there's different, right? So these are really crazy curly fries that are all twisted and wrapped around, and they correspond to each other in different ways. There's a lot of places that they correspond differently. So we can see different structural organizations. And here, actually it looks a lot like that, doesn't it? Yeah, I'm not so bad. I'm going to take what I can get on this one. Okay? So I don't know if the Dallas Museum of Art is responding to my letter submitting my work for exhibition there. But if you guys could like tweet them or something and tell them they should start to take my art and let them know that it actually looks a lot like the real science, I'm sure that would help my case there. But in the meantime, this is our closed pore. Remember, we want to open it up so ions can travel through. So when there's binding, they basically induce what's called conformational change. They basically rotate and they'll open up. Okay? So we talk a lot about this stuff, and these is an even more detailed version of all those curly fries version of the proteins. Okay? So this is just there for your visual pleasure. So we can learn a little bit about these proteins and ion channels, because we're going to talk about them a lot. And sometimes I find it weird and hard to just learn about this when you just see that cartoon of these chunks on a membrane. You don't really know all these little abbreviations and all the stuff that it's referring to within the broader context. So this is there to provide some of that broader context. Okay? But we can see it characterized in all sorts of different ways. It's all the same basic idea. Hopefully you see this big extracellular domain, small intracellular, and we have our transmembrane sections. And then, of course, we're looking through the channel and we can see that pore in the middle of our ions. Okay? Everybody good? Cool. All right, so now we can go back to our simple cartoons. I thought this was complicated when I first started reading them. Like, what the heck is all these abbreviations, blah, blah, blah. But after going through all this stuff, I'm like, oh, this looks pretty easy. Yeah? Okay. So,
could you actually go back a couple of slides? Just wanted to see what those abbreviations stood for. Not either one of those, the LVD and TMD and all that, or NT.
Transmembrane domain.
Okay.
The D is going to be domain
bound.
Each one. Huh?
Okay.
Let's see here.
Like bilayer domain?
Yeah.
The ligand binding.
Ligand binding, yes.
Ligand binding.
Yeah, because that's
Okay.
ligand binding.
Is
There. I'm not sure exactly what that means off the top of my head, but we can sort it out. This is from the paper in 2009. Sobolewski that first characterized and reported this. But again, the idea is that is greater complexity than you're going to need to know to win at this class. But it's here to provide broader breadth and context. And so some of the stuff that we will need to focus on are some of this basic information. So we have our basic glutamate receptors, these AMPA receptors, and they can have these different types of subunits. Okay? And they can be arranged differentially. So basically you can have subunit A1, A2, okay, so A1 is this lighter pink, A2 is sort of in red, and A3 this deeper, darker red. Okay, so we can see these different organizations and structures to that. And so we can see that each of these individual subunits add up to form our protein chain. Okay, now what we'll talk about is particularly AMPA receptor A2, okay, so before LTP is really happening during the normal what we call a basal state, when the cell's just hanging out, most of the AMPA receptors that are hanging out inside our membrane, okay, they're going to be the ones that are basically have these alpha 2 subunits. But after LTP is being induced and when the activity is really happening, all the good action is going down, okay, it's going to be a lot of these alpha 1 subunits as well. Okay, so they are what's going to be increased into the membrane as a function of this electrical stimulation of LTP. Very good? Okay? So we'll focus on these guys a lot in those. Okay? So, yes ma'am.
You say you increase the amount of subunits in the
Well,
receptors?
We'll increase the number of receptors that have those subunits. So this is a really good question. Clarification. It's not the subunits that are being recycled and changed and exchanged in and out of the membrane. It's the whole receptors, but they happen to be receptors that are comprised of these types of subunits at that point.
Okay, so in a cell where you can observe that LTP is happening, you'll see more of the glue A1 than the glue A3?
Afterward, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, beforehand you might see more of these guys.
Okay.
Yeah, really good question. On the top of things. All right. So here we have our representative AMPA receptor cell. Okay. Now we mentioned these serine sites. Okay, which are basically going to be these spots where these subunits can be phosphorylated. And remember we talked about the role that kinases can play in phosphorylating. Okay. And then we talked about how things can be unphosphorylated as well by phosphatases. Remember the ACE breaks things down. Okay, like acetylcholinesterase. Okay, being another way to remember it, think of Ace Ventura breaks everything he touches. Yeah, is Ace Ventura too old of a reference? You guys know who he is? No? You don't? Oh man, you're in for a treat when you go home and watch a movie later. You know Jim Carrey? Okay, there was a movie that made him famous. He was a nobody, and then he did this like really low budget movie that got absolutely ripped by the critics. Like, this is the dumbest movie I've ever seen. This is gonna be horrible. And then it became this massive hit because it was like so stupid.
Bad.
Basically.
So bad it's good.
But to be fair, he did a really. I mean, it was actually a really good movie. It's just.
No, it's sort of his like insanity sort of thing.
Yeah,
Like,
he had a
so
very
crazy.
manic base of life, I suppose. Anyways, he was a character named Ace, and he broke lots of stuff. So, acetylcholine, the phosphatases will break stuff down, that suffix, and we know that they can unphosphorylate things. So we know that that's happening, and there's sites that happens at, okay? And the different sites that these serines are working on, okay, to phosphorylate, so say phosphorylate P here, different places to phosphorylate the first, second, or third, are where that happens on our protein channel is going to differentially affect what happens. Okay? So remember we just showed all those curly fries of proteins of what this actually is? Now that should make all the sense in the world that depending on what you do and where is going to result in different things, right? It's actually a pretty complex structure. Everybody on board with that idea? Okay, so we have these different serine sites. Don't worry, you're not going to have to memorize these weird like ser 818, 831, whatever. Those details are not something I'm going to stress on an exam or something like that. They're still good to know, but remember about the big picture and the stuff that we're actually talking about here. Okay, so these are our phosphorylation sites. We can see them represented at different points here. Okay, now our protein kinase A or pKa here. Okay, this happens to be the site where serine 845 is going to be phosphorylated, and what it ends up doing is leading to the trafficking of our receptors to the extrasynaptic region. Okay, so we have P45, P3. This will traffic these receptors to our synaptic region. Okay, now other sites, PKC, protein kinase C. It's going to do something different. It's going to help to anchor that protein channel in the membrane by virtue of the postsynaptic density. Okay, so think of it as like a boat. Okay, something that has to drive the boat there, traffic it, right? Once it's by shore, it needs to dock. Something needs to anchor it or tie it to the dock, right? So different things are going to work to do those different jobs. Okay, and finally we can have this thing called CAM kinase 2, and that's going to work to help to change the channel so that it allows the calcium to come in from the extracellular areas of the cell. So remember we talked about, where's our guy? All these different things and how they have to change and induce these conformational changes to allow ions to flow. So calcium doesn't really flow through here real easily, but we kind of want it to at times. And so things have to be changed in order to do that, and that's what CAM kinase is helping to do, to help to phosphorylate this other serine so that more calcium can be allowed in, together with its good pal sodium. Okie doke. Alright, so we're going to talk about these other things called TARPs, transmembrane AMPA regulatory proteins, because these guys of our AMPA receptors that we just talked about are not hanging out in isolation. We start with a simple framework, but we're now adding more complex players to the game. And of course we have our postsynaptic density in here, and there's stuff that helps to anchor it. Okay? Some of those players we introduced earlier, stargazing. Okay? These different serine motifs where you're going to have CAM kinase come in and work together to induce some of the changes that we want. So we have these TARPs, or these regulatory proteins that come together with our AMPA receptors. Okay? These are proteins that are regulatory, that come together here, and they help to our transmembrane. And what we're going to see happens is CAM kinase comes in, binds with our different serines. That's going to lead to the ability for our AMPA receptor of interest to get structurally woven in with greater strength to our postsynaptic density. So see how here we have this stuff that was otherwise hanging out by the membrane, now ends up coming down and binding and forming connections with these other structures that are within our PSD. And you can imagine, I hope pretty clearly, how that can actually strengthen that sort of anchoring of that protein here. Because remember what we said a few slides ago, the role that's normally happening constitutively, naturally, is these are just cycling through. Right? Constitutive, which means it's always cycling and going through. Now, we don't really want that to be happening, do we? Because I get distracting when you have a goofy professor like this walking back and forth. Oh God, I'm so glad this cap was on. I thought for a moment it wasn't.
Somebody would have probably said something.
Yeah. You guys are probably sitting there, guys, going, oh my God. Oh, I'm so glad. Okay, so we want that to kind of be slowed down. We want to anchor this so that it's no longer being pushed constitutively through. Okay, and that's what this is happening. So we'll talk about the role. So when calcium comes in, remember we started off saying we have our magnesium blocker here. It's kicked out of the NMDA receptor by virtue of calcium influx from the extracellular domain. Okay, now we have calcium inside here. Calcium works to activate from calcium to CAM kinase 2. CAM kinase 2 comes in. It binds with our serine motifs that we talked about to help phosphorylate some of these things. Activates these TARPs, or these transmembrane AMPA receptors, proteins, to change, right? Because they're hanging out in a chilled out fashion. See how they're kind of like, it's kind of like a bat hanging out in a cave, right? They're all like tucked up like this, although upside down. I can't do that for you guys right now. I guess I could go upside down, but you guys really have to beg now if you're going to do that. And they're kind of hung up like a bat, right? Now what happens when the bat needs to go somewhere or do something? You start. I went to a bat cave over Christmas break, and you know it's a bat cave, and then there's all this stuff flying around, going back this way, right? The bats start flying, so they go from this sort of here. Now they extend their wings out, right? So that's kind of what's happening here. These are kind of just hung up, kind of like this, and now they're able to stretch out and grab stuff and hold on and be cemented more in that postsynaptic density. Good? Yeah? I lost you guys by being crazy? Okay.
What role does stargazing play again?
It's basically, where do I stargazing? It's one of the sort of connecting proteins that's going to allow it to bond. So we'll take a closer look at it. But we're going to look at CAM kinase first. Okay? So we talked about influx of calcium, phosphorylation at that site through that terminal of stargazing. Okay, so it's over here, and then we talked about the binding to that postsynaptic density. Okay, by basically PSD95. And so ultimately, right, our goal is to trap this receptor in the PSD so it gets anchored, so it stops me walking around a constitutive process. Right. So that's what our goal is by virtue of this, okay? And by basically allowing this CAM kinase 2 to phosphorylate more stargazing here, it's going to prevent that. So let's take a look at CAM kinase a little bit and see what's happening here, okay? So we're going to talk about a couple things. The way that operates is through something called calmodulin. So calmodulin basically hangs out by its own. When calcium comes rushing into the cell by virtue of our NMDA receptors that we talked about over there, okay, calcium comes in and makes friends with calmodulin. And when we make friends with people, we help each other to grow, right? We help each other to change and become better people.
Hopefully.
Indeed, hopefully. I'm trying to be nice and generous, right? Because of course we know that's not always the case. But the point is we still change each other, either for good or for bad. We're going to stick on the positive side of things. Be like the second half of Bill Murray's movie, not the first half where he changes for the worse. Okay? So, regardless, as it makes friends with calmodulin and binds, it induces what we refer to as that conformational change in calmodulin. So see how it's shaped like this? When calcium comes in, it changes the shape of our purple calmodulin to be organized in a different fashion. Well, that's all you gotta know for this class, because we're talking about a cartoon picture in blue and purple. Heck, I can draw that. Okay, don't worry about all the other crazy, well, what's the conformation change? Don't worry about that jazz. All right? We're going to see that as that happens, it's going to allow other proteins to bind, okay, that otherwise don't have calcium binding sites. Okay, and one of those big targets is CAM kinase 2 that we introduced a moment ago. So this is our CAM kinase 2. So if we come back here, remember we're looking at this, and I'm going to break this down for you. Okay, so calcium comes in together with calmodulin, starts to work on CAM kinase 2. Okay, here's our CAM kinase. It's comprised of several different things. Okay, we're good at time. We are good at time, right?
12 minutes.
12 minutes. Let's jazz this up. CAM kinase 2. A couple different sites. We have a site that's catalytic, so basically over here, but it's kind of on the inside, and it's not able to work. Okay? We also have a regulatory domain, which is kind of this thing. Okay? It's also kind of like bent in and isn't really able to work. So remember there's like binding sites on this stuff? We looked at those, like the curly fry proteins. There's different sites where stuff binds. Same idea is here. They're not really available to be bound, but when calcium comes in with calmodulin and it comes together with our CAM kinase 2, everything changes here. So this is the same structure. Our colors, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? Now, this is opened up. Okay? And so we have now this phosphorylation site that you can think of basically wasn't available before. Now it starts to become available. Okay? So it was unexposed. Now it becomes exposed. And things can start to be activated. And now we have these two sites that were not exposed otherwise because they're all like crunched up inside. Right? It's kind of like a flower. Like the petals hadn't bloomed yet, so everything's all like crunched up. Right? So it's there, but we mean it's not exposed to the outside world. Now it starts to bloom and open up, and we can see those petals come out. They become exposed for all the bees to come and get their pollen. Does that make sense? Okay. So I know sometimes this might get a little confusing. So now this is exposed, okay? And it basically, by virtue of being able to activate this kinase, now both of these domains become exposed, okay? As does our phosphorylation site. And so basically what this is going to do is be able to keep our kinase in this active state even when our second messenger system, calcium calmodulin, becomes associated. Because now this is going to be permanently open. Now this is just one little unit. Remember we looked at that whole big like circular thing a moment ago? Let's take a look at it. Let's put the pieces together. Okay? So we looked at one little unit here. Remember there's a complex that we looked at. So it's actually, they're actually arranged in these rings. And we just looked at one little unit. This is how it normally is, chilling out. Like the bat hanging out, just chilling in the cave, sleeping. Now it becomes awoken. All right? Excuse me. A lot of cams going on here. Calmodulin comes in. We had this opening of these sites that are now exposed. Okay, so the bat kind of like spreads its wings out. You guys can tell me to stop with the bat analogy if you need me to. It's okay. I'm trying to have it make more sense, but if that's not succeeding and it's making less sense, by all means, ring the bell and tell me to like tone it down. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. We good? Okay. It's hard. I'm not going to know unless you say something. Right? I'll be fair here. Hanging out, just chilling. Calcium calmodulin comes in, like we just talked about, and it opens those. It dissociates these components. Now they're exposed a little bit more, and what that does is now this ring can start to be complex like this, so that when calcium calmodulin is no longer on here, so this is our little purple and blue guy. Remember I said I can draw that. Now it's no longer on here, but it's been activated. So it'll stay this way, even though it's no longer bound. Are we good? All right. So that's kind of the idea. So holoenzyme here, what that means is it's ring-like structure. Okay? So that's kind of a crazy word, but if you see that, we're talking about these rings. Okay? We just started kind of like Drake from the bottom. We just built up from a singular component. It was one of these little guys, but now we've built up here, and like Drake, now we're here. Okay? Alright,
Does the calcium come onto and bind the subunits together, or are they already bound together whenever that comes around?
well, it starts to dissociate a little bit, okay? So, they're already sort of, they're bound together here, but the sites that we want to expose are towards the inside, like the inside of that flower petal, and we want it to bloom outwards so that they become accessible. And so that's what it does, it opens them up. So these here were curved in.
Yeah.
So what it does is it opens them up.
But all the subunits were already connected to each other before that.
It appears that they are definitely like physically connected. But the issue, remember, think of those big, crazy proteins, right? And they're, because that's really how all this stuff was, right? We look at it in a nice, simple cartoon, but just because they're there physically doesn't mean that something that's right here has access to work on something that's right here.
Yeah.
We need to change that a little bit so that they can see each other. That's all, conceptually. Okay, so those are some of the aspects of what's happening here, and so that was one aspect of how some of the dynamics of our AMPA receptors can be trafficked. Okay, we're going to come to the back end now and talk about these actin components. Okay, so actin is that cytoskeleton structure. Okay, it's a physical, it's sort of a long strand of a structure in the cell, helps to form. It holds these spines sort of in place. So this is our sort of dendritic spine here. This is sort of the neck of the spine. We can see these long filaments that we call actin. Okay? So what we need to do, we have our postsynaptic density here. Okay? We need to break that actin apart. We talked about this at the end of class last time. But this is our sort of, we're walking along this way. We need to bust up that sidewalk cement so we can insert more AMPA receptors, and then we need to re-cement it. So that's what we'll do. We're going to break that up. So here's our actin. It's constantly being created. You can think of it kind of as a treadmill. It's moving along from these little components to then being built into these long filaments. Okay? And once you get these filaments, they make these structural components of the cytoskeletal components of the cell. Okay, so it's constantly turning over, kind of like that treadmill idea. Okay, and there's different aspects to it. So we call F-actin and G-actin. These little tiny parts are G-actin. These longer parts are F-actin. Okay, so there's different aspects and ways that we can have this actin basically composed and decomposed. Okay, so when you have basically our little tiny filaments here, here's this protein called cofilin. Okay, and we can look at the role that phosphorylation plays in it. So when cofilin is unphosphorylated, you have just these tiny filaments. But when it becomes phosphorylated, cofilin works to basically compose those filaments. Okay, so basically polymerize or depolymerize. Make sense? Okay, so you have the unphosphorylated type, it's broken up, and when it's phosphorylated, it's together. Now remember, we said that our goal is to take a sledgehammer, bust up this concrete on the sidewalk, right? Put our handprints in the Hollywood star of fame in the concrete, and then we want it to be strengthened back up. Okay, so if we want to do that, we're going to have to do phosphorylation and unphosphorylation to break up the respective parts and then build them back together. So that should come as no surprise when we talk about the ways that happens. Okay, so again, we're walking across that sidewalk of the membrane. Okay, and we're trying to accomplish that goal. So here's what we're having. We're trying to go. These are moving across here, but remember, there's not a lot of receptors here, and they're moving slow because it's generally tied up together in our postsynaptic density. We have all these cytoskeletal structures, our actin holding things in place. We need to go, pow, break it up, so that we can insert our receptors into the membrane to support LTP. Then we got to tie it all back together. Okay? So these F-actin dynamics are held together by other structural components called spectrins. Okay? That's what these little black components are. We're holding that together. Okay? Now, we want to chop these apart. Unfortunately, if you take a sledgehammer to our dendritic spines, you're going to be very sad, because you're going to screw everything up because they don't respond very well to sledgehammers because it just breaks it and kills it. what we need to do is not use a sledgehammer, we use these little cat spaces. Okay? These little Pac-Man style things, they come in there and they're like, snip, 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 snip. Start cutting these things up. Okay, so they disassemble the actin. Okay? Call them calpain. Okay, that's these little green Pac-Man guys. Okay? So calcium rushes in, calcium is our little blue thing and binds to our calpain, and it comes in and it snips up these spectrums and starts to allow the dissociation there. So we still don't have all these receptors here that we really want, but we want to fill this up to strengthen the synapse, right? To make LTP happen more. So that's what we want to do. We want to see that we can add more in here. Now here it's tough to get more in here because once he starts getting here, it's like traffic jam. It's like, oh, I got to get through all this crap, right? Now, or that's what it was like here. Now it starts to be broken up a little bit. See how they're not there as much? We've got these spectrums are no longer holding them structurally in place. Everybody on board? Okay. Now we can push more of these in here. Make sense? I think it's really cool. I think it's fascinating and phenomenal that this happens naturally in an organized, systematic fashion. You can just, sort of a chaos system. There's an organized, systematized thing. I think it's really, really impressive. There does seem to be a method to our natural madness here. And I think that type of design is really cool. So we can see that, and then we can just see some evidence here scientifically to verify that model. Because when you can do experimental approaches that disrupt those components, we can see how it changes the dynamics of LTP. Okay, so we can see the time frame. When you stimulate here, this is the time when it's really vulnerable to disruption by virtue of that low frequency stimulation, because now LTP no longer persists. It's very vulnerable during this early time period, but if you stimulate later, it's still very stable. It's resistant to that disruption. Okay? And so it tells us again that there's a time frame that's important here. So what we can look here and just see some structural images. These are dendritic spines. We can see big ones here shown in yellow, the little tiny ones shown in blue. Okay? And the larger ones stay more stable. So this is like a time-lapse thing over time. The ones pointed to by yellow, these larger structural ones, stay consistent over time, and the smaller ones seem to go away or come. Okay, so again, suggesting that there's actually a structural component to LTP as well. Okay, which ties together to this actin story as well. Okay, and so when we use other experimental approaches of drugs that can interfere with how actin is polymerized, right? So you take G-actin, you want to polymerize, but it's polymerized. Polymerize it into our F-actin strands. You know it's getting time to go, and I started like, we can see that when you interfere with that ability for G-actin to be constructed and polymerized into F-actin, when you interfere with that by drugs, you interfere with the ability for LTP to happen. And you do that early in, okay? But later on, it doesn't. Okie doke. So that's kind of the idea. Again, it brings us back to our home that we started with. That timing is important on this. And the way that that works as well is this myosin motor. Okay? You can read about that in Chapter 4 with a little bit more detail. But the idea, as you might imagine, is it's a structural component that helps to assemble and disassemble and stabilize these synapses. And timing, again, is important here too. So again, look at the timing of when these different components are done. And we will sort of, I just want to introduce you these ideas, and you can read, I'm expecting that you guys can catch up on them in just the last 2 or 3 pages, Chapter 4, of these different pathways for how these can happen to do the structural linking that can help support these things. And you can check out the cadherins and receptors. And the last thing, please indulge me just 1 minute. It's so cool, I wish we had more time to talk about it. You can start to have what's called these cadherins, or these proteins, that can dimerize. So you have a 1, and now it becomes a dimer, which means 2. With high-frequency stimulation, they actually leave connections between the presynaptic and postsynaptic cell. They start to tether. It's incredible. Okay? And so high-frequency stimulation, look, this doubles. It gets more strong, and you get more receptors in the membrane. Okay? And this becomes stronger there. So it's really, I think, really cool. So you're actually creating these physical connections between the cells, okay? And so we can see that, these cadherins and integrins here. So hopefully I can introduce that. Please read that a little bit and catch up on it. I know I can't really probably a moment or two afterwards. Thank you for indulging me. This is basically just shows you more of that information. So thank you. Have a great time. Celebrate Groundhog Day. Push hot. Related.
Yes.
Okay. Is there any like specific time you're trying to do it? Because I have a spot for flexible and I can change it.
Yes, I love it. I know.
Oh, so around March, like late March? Okay, that works for me too. I mean, later the better. Oh, what's your name? Rachel. Okay, I'll send you an email then on the.
In the meantime,
Sure.
hello, Amy. I'm Nate.
Sure.
Have a good day.
Oh, later, man. How's it going, Frenchie?
Pretty good. I just want to say thank you.
Oh, no problem. Meeting tonight?
Oh yeah, are you gonna
I
be there?
remember when there was
50-50.
Okay.
What time and place?
It starts at 7:30,
Same
but
place I was at before?
no, it's on the fountain thing. Right there in front of the student union, where like the big.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
But so like the meeting will start at 7:30, but the worship will be 10.
Awesome. I look forward to it. If I can make it.
Sure, of course. And we'll have our remember how I told you we're part of like the parent ministry and everything? We'll have the coordinators of our area will be there in case you want to.
Oh, cool. That'd be great. If I can, I will. I've got a lot going on right now. I got a couple projects I'm working on, so like I said, 50-50. I will do my best.
Yeah, no problem.
Tell them I say hi if I can't make it.
Of course. I don't know if the number that I have for you still is the same one.
530-220-4056.
I'll just double check. Go ahead.
Hello.
Do you know when the start of the presentations are going to be? Like, I know it's basically going to be one presentation per day, right? Or how is it going to work?
It depends on when people sign up. Have you looked at the sign-up sheet?
I tried to look at it last night, but I didn't see a sign-up sheet there.
I will re-email it then.
Oh, it's gonna be on the email.
Well, I had sent out a Google document that was not, you get an email about the Google document. Have you used that before?
Oh, okay. Makes sense. I thought it was going to be on the e-learning website.
Not yet. It might be.
Okay.
But we need it to be interactive so that everybody can sign up for it in the way that the Google documents operate and to be interactive is my goal. Now, it sounds like there might be a couple of snafus around that, so I'm going to look into it and try to fix it up for you guys. But we'll sort it out.
Okay. Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. But find a partner.
Yeah.
Just a question. For the presentations, do you have like a timestamp, like middle of the...
Oh, what?
Like a time?
Yeah, you might be one of the people that maybe didn't work for on the thing. I just had the days listed on a chart, and you just sign up for the day on the chart.
Alright. Cool.
Yeah. Sorry if it didn't work. I'll sort it out, and we'll figure it out. It's an easy thing to figure out.
Thank you.
We'll get it.
I really enjoyed class today.
Thanks. I try to make it wacky on purpose, but let me know if it doesn't hit the mark.
I'm learning a lot of new pharmacology classes.
Ah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
No problem. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah,
Neurobiology
I'll
Yeah, go figure.
Yeah.
Alright, let me get this out of here.
You get in touch with me, so
Oh, really?
Really, and I do a lot of cognitive work, which is
What did you study?
So, I was a psych major in college and communication psychology in grad school.
Oh, cool. What do you teach here?
I teach, all kinds of stuff. This is children and media, which is,
I know it's children and media.
so this class is children and media.
instead of Mary.
I'm in the,
I'm not sure if I'm familiar with that.
we're housed in ATEC, so the new ATEC school has